Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 465th New Social Environment. I'm Kai, the Senior Production Assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between artist Keith Mayerson and Rail Editor-at-Large Jason Rosenfeld on Mayerson's current show, My American Dream, This Land is Your Land, on view at Karma through January 8th. We are thrilled to welcome the poet Caroline Crumpacker here, who will read to close today's program. We would also like to thank our friends at Karma for sponsoring today's event. A few notes before we get started. The Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you all to check the chat in just a moment for a living document of resources and actions. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Keith Mayerson received a BA from Brown University and an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. Since the George W. Bush era, his long-running nonlinear narrative, My American Dream, has been presented in separate chapters. Mayerson's work was featured in the Cleveland Museum of Contemporary Art, the 2014 Whitney Biennial, and the Whitney Museum's inaugural downtown show, America is Hard to See. Recent solo exhibitions include Elaine, the Kooning House Foundation, Marlborough Gallery, and The Bridge. He is professor of art and art and chair of painting, drawing, and printmaking at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California. Distinguished chair and professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College, Jason Rosenfeld has curated exhibitions John Everett Millay at Tate Britain and the Van Gogh Museum, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde at Tate Britain and the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., and River Crossings at Olana and Cedar Grove in Hudson and Catskill, New York. He is a co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. Jason, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Ty. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Keith. How are you?
Thank you. Oh, I'm so grateful and honored to be here. Thanks so much, Jason, and the Brooklyn Rail and Karma. Just really pleased and proud. And Caroline Crumpacker, my great, wonderful, genius poet friend. So glad to be joining all of you and to be here today. Thank you.
Excellent. It's really going to be fun. I think everyone's going to enjoy it. And we have a lot to talk about. Welcome to the 465th Zoom New Social Environment. We've been doing this strong since March of 2020. I'm coming to you live from the West Village in the middle of our first polar vortex of 2022. Keith is coming to you from Laguna Beach, I believe, in California, where it looks to be really cloudy and nasty out. And
oh, terrible.
You know, yeah, we're not going to talk about it. I want to thank, first off, the folks at Karma, especially Emily Tippett, who very kindly got me into the gallery to see the show when it was closed, which was awesome. It closes, by the way, January 8th. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Also, Caroline for being our poet today. And thanks also to, of course, Nick for arranging everything, Ty and Fong and the folks at the Rail. And also personal thank you to Jalen Hurts for leading the Philadelphia Eagles back to the playoffs. That's right. Very important. Keith is an extraordinary individual, a poet of optimism, an artist of optimism in a land of deep pessimism. I don't know how much of the country he's traversed. I know I still have like 6 states I've never been to. But I know he was born in Cincinnati, brought up in Colorado, schooled in Providence. Then he spent time at UC Irvine, home of the Anteaters, and then New York City, teaching in New York and working, and then now Laguna Beach, also Riverside. I think been all over the place. Knows America well and its history.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see that very much in evidence today. Let's go to the videotape, or rather the imagery. So follow Keith on Instagram. He's got a lively and excellent site where he posts a lot of his own art and a lot of his writings, which we'll also talk about. He is a prolific writer about what he's up to. And here is the webpage from Karma, where you see the show is on right now. My American Dream, This Land is Your Land, opened in mid-November and it closes this coming Saturday. Am I right? Keith, it's not extended, right?
That's right.
Well,
I wish, I could only hope, but
yeah.
I'm so pleased and proud to be there and so great. The Karma folks are amazing. So just so grateful.
They're great, and it's on East 2nd Street, and there's 2 locations right near each other, 188 and 172 East 2nd Street, and they are bookended by 2 excellent Italian restaurants, well-priced and delicious food. I've been multiple times. Here is the image of the facade of 188 East 2nd Street, and here's a detail of the front window with its painting, simply titled Liberty from 2018, and a detail of Lady Liberty herself, torch and head crown ablaze. So welcome, Keith, and congratulations on an exceptional show. This has been acknowledged in the press, multiple places, including the paper of record, the New York Times, and other venues. It's a salute to you and your tireless labor. I don't know, your ability to make paintings is unparalleled. He's a tireless worker, and you're going to see the products of that. But I love the way that it starts with a work that is visible from the street, as if a kind of enticement, both to come into the gallery, but also, of course, per the themes of the show, to come into America. In a sense, and it functions really well, and it's perfectly sized. Were you thinking about that? Thinking about this window when you made this work?
No, not really, but I'm so glad it is framed so well, and it does work, I think, as an outside painting. I used to teach at NYU for many years. I would take the kids on the Staten Island ferry to do plein air sketching, and we would always pass by the Liberty, and everybody was furiously drawing, me included. And I went on a boat with Andrew, my husband, and it was actually right before Katrina happened. There was something kind of looming on the landscape there and in our psychology. And I took this photo that I then painted. And, of course, even then I was thinking about ideas of liberty and the agency and everything that the Statue of Liberty stands for. But painting it during the Trump era, it became particularly pertinent. And I like how paintings sort of, for me, fall apart into sort of abstraction. And she sort of falls apart the more you look at her in detail, but hopefully keeping it together, holding it strong, and keeping democracy and America for everything it stands for intact and beholden in our still tumultuous era.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a key tenet of the whole exhibition, as people will see. It's a real hopeful look at America and its history and what it has spawned and what it has inspired in foreigners. I mean, we'll see that as well, because of course this was a gift of the French government, although the base was made by an American. People always talk about it's as tall as the Statue of Liberty, but this brings it to life, really. When you're looking at this painting, the statue itself is the same height as the base, Richard Morris Hunt's base. So the statue is, yeah, if it was standing on the ground, I don't think it would be nearly as impressive. We will talk about your process, but the medium here is what, Keith?
Oil and linen. And so, and I work from what Turner couldn't do. I work from high res, high definition photographs. And so I'm really thinking of the tooth and the comb of every pixel as I paint it. And hopefully thinking consciously about my thoughts about what it means, but also unconsciously other stuff seeps through. And hopefully this is an emotive landscape painting of everything that we strive for and fight for in our great nation.
Yeah. So oil and linen. So in the talk today, people are looking at the visuals. If there's no artist name, it's by Keith. And the default medium is oil and linen, as you'll see. So when you walk into Karma in 188, the main gallery space, this is your vista straight ahead. And you see that, as we will talk about, Keith is very deliberate in the hang of his works. There is a curatorial intelligence that goes into everything that he is doing in terms of how you are experiencing the works and the space. And on your left, you can see there's a small painting here, glowing with a kind of gold background. And this is the view that you get if you turn to your right over the desk and down this sort of hall there to the right, where the people who work in the gallery are sitting. There's a painting on the wall there. The title of the show is My American Dream. This land is your land. And My American Dream, as Ty mentioned, is an ongoing project by Keith. And just about every one of your exhibits has that title maybe with a subtitle, as it expands and expands as you go through his work. So Sunrise at the Grand Canyon of 2017 is what you see from a little bit of a distance, but that's okay. It's all about a vista over the desks in the front entranceway. This brilliant sunrise, of course, looking east at the Grand Canyon from the South Rim, 2017, oil on linen, a large scale picture, and there's just detail there on the right. So you get a little bit of sense of the texture. The Grand Canyon is a consistent motif in your work. It's a unavoidable cleft in the countryside of America, but it's someplace that you spent a lot of time, I take it.
Yeah, and thanks for acknowledging all that. You know, I come from comics, and so I really think about my installs as a kind of comic on the wall or a fresco. I know we're going to talk about that, where each painting acts kind of like a panel, a comic, and then put together as a nonlinear narrative. And this is a nonlinear narrative called My American Dream that I started really since 9/11, about the America that I love to live in with my husband, Andrew Madrid, who's also Latino and part Indigenous, that we could be together and strive for what it is that we all want to fight for in our country. And each show for me is like a chapter in this ongoing sort of wordless novel on the wall. And the Karma folks are really great about acknowledging that and letting, you know, we did some editing back and forth in terms of particular ideas, but really they let me do the layout as I wished, and really thinking about the install where the placement is very important for what image works for another. I love the idea of the sublime. I teach Kant and the critique of judgment now at USC. And I really think, even though Kant said artists can't necessarily achieve the idea of the sublime, that overwhelming feeling where you're a small part of a much bigger thing. And therefore, hopefully you think about the interconnectivity of everything and how we all relate to one another on this planet. And certainly at the Grand Canyon, Andrew and I love going there because you really feel that sublime whoosh of feeling and the greatness of the country and the earth and the flora and the fauna. And I feel like even conservatives have to agree that the national parks are amazing. If we could start thinking about how the national parks are so important for the beauty of America, and maybe we could start thinking about clean air and water and the flora and the fauna, and how we need to keep it together to stay together as a country and as a nation. And so for me, I'm working with that high-res image and really doing a lot of detail, thinking about Turner and the Hudson River School and everything that they were about, but also, you know, the sort of Emersonian idea of the American transcendentalist spirit of how everything is sort of alive in nature, and wanting to bring that part out.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong thread in a lot of your work, and especially a lot of your landscape work. And there's not that much landscape in this actual exhibition, but it is a strong part of your production. And thinking about the Hudson River School, here's the great Gifford at the Met, a gorge in the mountains, Cotterskill Clove, that's how he spelled it, from 1862, speaking about the Hudson River Valley and this exquisite Turnerian sun. So we've had two mentions already of the greatest painter of the first half of the 19th century. That was Jmw Turner. He's not French, mind you, he's British, and a sublime landscape painter and a man who traveled as much as he could within his means, and who sort of redefined for Western eyes the idea of light and distance and vista, and the way that history plays a role in your everyday landscapes. And Gifford is someone who's worshiping at the altar of Turner in a painting like this one on the right. And also that connectivity between the East Coast and the West Coast and the West, which is so evident in the Hudson River School, and then its outreach in later generations.
Yeah, exactly. I hope that the landscapes act as sort of tent post here from the landscape of Liberty, and then this sort of represents the West. I mean, albeit it's in Arizona, and then we have more landscapes with the show. But I think a lot about Turner, of, you know, the Western European, that tradition, how he transcended into, especially later in life, those almost abstract, apocalyptical kind of works they did. And I also love the luminous. I love Gifford. I love the Hudson River School. I love Kinset. You know, when the Met reopened their American wing, we were all illuminated by Kinset and Gifford and all these great American landscape that's not so much manifest destiny as, you know, some of the school is about.
Yeah, I mean, this land is your land, this land is my land, this sort of shared idea of space, which is so essential. Space,
That's
both
right.
environmental and also sort of communal. So, so across from, as I already showed you, across from this painting with this bolt of light, which is burning through, and literally from the east wall of the gallery, you get a painting right across, which is Duccio's The Temptation of Christ in America after Duccio from 2021. A new painting on the left. This is Keith's oil on panel, and with this interesting frame. And then on the right here is your typical Heinrich Wölfflin art historical comparative, two objects shown at once. This is the actual painting by Duccio di Buoninsegna, the great Sienese painter of the late 13th, early 14th century. His image of Christ casting out the devil. And this is a scene from the predella of the Maestà altarpiece, which originally sat at the high altar of Siena Cathedral and then was broken up wantonly and sold off. Parts of it, most of it is still in Siena. This little panel is one of the treasures of the Frick collection, and a work which obviously you have communed with deeply.
Oh yeah, I love Duccio, and I love just the meta idea of like how this was part of an altarpiece. Like my shows are all part of a sort of a string of images that tell the story just like an altarpiece would, but then separate. Hopefully they hold their own for their own allegorical intent. And of course, Duccio helped to bring warmth into icon painting and bring us towards the Renaissance. And I did an appropriation of the Madonna and Child at the Met, which is so incredible and almost like floats at night, like night in a museum when you're not there. And this one at the Frick, I always, you know, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, but I always say a little prayer to it when I'm there and really meditate upon it and really think about the idea of, you know, casting out evil. And it actually works, kind of like a Buddhist Thangka painting. Or, you know, for Duccio, I think coming from an iconic tradition, really thinking that the characters that he's portraying are really alive and that he's communicating with them, and therefore it brings a real spirit to them. You know, of course, I'm thinking about January 6th and the insurrection and the minions of Trump and Trumpism and so on, and hoping as sort of a prayer, non-denominational for myself and the country, doing this painting really helped to think of you know, the good powers that be casting out the negative evil spirits from our country. It starts out on the right with the Empire State Building. On the left, you see the Trans-America Building from San Francisco. He's standing on the Capitol, Jesus is. And there's also LA in between there, and in different parts of New York that fit very cleanly into the sort of the toy town of Duccio. Which is also there. And so I think of this as an allegory painting, but also trying to get to this real spirit of Duccio and the cosmic relatability of all that it portrays. There's a lot of secret little things in Duccio, like there in the halo around Christ's head, there were all these weird inscriptions that my friend Celeste P. Spencer said are actually supposed to be gateways into heavenly other worlds. And it's really amazing to look at the master and try to follow him while at the same time listening to like Jesus Christ Superstar and my half Jewish way of thinking about Catholicism, watching the films and everything and thinking about everything that's about. And you know, of course,
I think every Jewish kid like you and me who was born in the late 60s, their parents had the soundtrack to Jesus Christ Superstar, and we all listened to it and danced around on the rug and did whatever. It's definitely
exactly. And the frame, of course, is an appropriation of the actual frame that is at the Frick, and along with these other panels that had been separated from the Maestà.
Yeah, and just a detail here on the right of the devil, and then the Washington Monument has this little smile at the top, although that's unintentional. And he's standing here, and they really are firmly standing on the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol. It's this wonderful image. It's almost like they're these, you know, I never thought of it before, Duccio, which is almost like a monster film with these massive beings like Godzilla traipsing through cities and warring while the people watch, the small people. And that is, of course, the sublime, the minuscule nature of the shrieking people in the city below. And then these great beings who are determining our fate, and there he is casting him out. It's fabulous. And one more detail here, there's the two angels, which I noted in your notes that may have been by another hand. They may be another hand in Duccio, but not here. And the Empire State Building, which, as we'll see shortly, is also a recurring motif in your work. But I also like, just a personal level, that the idea that, let me just go back for a second, that, whenever you go into a museum of Western art, you always start with a room with these gold back panel paintings, no matter where you go. That's being broken up a little bit now with different exhibition strategies. But the fact that you walk in there and hear this is this painting, this sort of supposed groundswell of the Western tradition. We know now that that's not true. It goes back much farther, but at least the Western painting tradition on panel or canvas. And I love the way that it sort of starts with that in this exhibition.
Yeah, I hope it was sort of a blessing for the show and a blessing for America. I'm glad that the Karma folks decided that would be the Ad and Art Forum and everything, just to get it out there.
Yeah, get it out there. So let's just whip through the first room really quickly, and then we'll talk about some of the individual works. And here's what Keith was talking about, the idea that, you always see pictures typically in museums and galleries today, painting, blank white space, maybe a text panel, although usually not in galleries, usually in museums, and then another painting, blank space, another painting, blah, 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 this sort of cadence of work along the wall. But you never think about them as sort of related, almost like a film strip in a sense, or a ribbon of imagery which interconnect and sort of speak to each other, both adjacently and also across the room. And that is what you see in this room, that they all speak to one another, as we'll talk about the three works on the left wall, the one work at the end, which is four works of people sort of seen more up close. And then as you turn around, and I hope people can visualize now the room, here's the Duccio tribute as we walked in. And then at the return wall, which you don't see until you sort of perambulate the room, is this image, which is extraordinary and special, and we'll talk about shortly. So that's the first space that sort of confronts you. And before we get into that, I know you want to talk about it, just to contextualize this for everybody, Keith has many different exhibition strategies. Here is an example of one of the rooms from his great show, which I did not see, but there's a large catalog, if you're lucky enough to snag it online, of My American Dream from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland from 2017, where you can see he's hung it very differently. It's not that linear ribbon of workspace. Instead, it's hung in what we call salon style, which goes back to French Royal Academy of Art exhibitions in the salon which were held in the Louvre in the 18th, 19th century, where pictures would be stacked up, just like in the Royal Academy of Arts in London. And you still see it in some places, exhibition places today. So all these works, which are all interrelated, but are condensed together on the wall. So this is the view that you see there from the MoCA show in Cleveland. And of course, the thing that it resonates with and that it resembles to the art historian's eye is the way that artists in the Renaissance dealt with consecutive and narratival imagery in fresco cycles in churches, whether it's Giotto or, in this case on the right, Piero della Francesca, his fabulous cycle of the Legend of the True Cross in San Francesco in Arezzo in Italy. So this idea that you have registers of imagery, if my students don't know that term by the end of the year, they're in big trouble on their exam. Imagery in a kind of a cartoon style. There's no other way to talk about it. And that is somewhat mimicked, in the way that you're doing those sort of installations.
Absolutely. I always think of these as, salon style is a great way of composing. And if you think of different ways of composing comics and graphic novels, panels on a page. You could think about panels on a wall. And I teach comics. I was the head comics teacher at School of Visual Arts for 25 years. Now I'm starting a whole visual narrative art program at USC. And I think about how images relate to one another all the time. Also, I was a semiotics major at Brown, which feeds into it. And I was always the cartoon guy on campus. And so I really think about how each image relates to one another, the space in between them, how what you see first, second, third, and why in terms of all these imagery. And people, I think back in the day would think of obviously these frescoes telling stories, but in the 20th and now 21st century iteration of installs, people are less inclined to see salons of images relating to one another. And also when you're doing a 20th, 21st century conventional install with, horses in a stable, like compositions of painting, space painting, people definitely don't think about the relatability of how one image creates a content and tells a story, which is weird to me, Jason, because Art Spiegelman will say, like, curators, as you well know, when you're doing a show in a museum or a gallery, are all about telling stories with images. And why not have that be true for artists as well? So that's something I'm really trying to strive for. I would tell the folks at SBA that I was an avant-garde cartoonist. I just work in galleries and museums with paintings, and they sort of believe me, but it's very much the engine that drives me. And I'm so great. The relatability here is amazing.
I would say that this is happening right now in a rare sense in New York, because some people in the audience may have been able to go to the Drawing Center to see the first two iterations of the display of Jack Shear's amazing drawing collection. And Jack hung the first iteration where you had amazing, interesting juxtapositions and works on top of each other, but each work spoke to the one next to it. And then Arlene Sheckett did the second iteration, which carried on that theme, but she painted the walls and had great benches, wooden benches that she carved. And Jarrett Ernest, I think, opens this week, the third iteration. Great. So that idea of having a discussion. Here's just another example, and I wanted to show your pictures from the Whitney Biennial in 2014, back when it was still uptown in the Breuer building, with this wonderful daring hang of single artist works in this area. And it reminded me of, as an art historian, Leo von Klenz's magnificent painting, which is in Munich, of the Camposanto in Pisa from 1858, with this extraordinary symbolic image of Christ with the earth, which resonates with this Kenneth Noland-like painting there at the top.
Well, I think at those I call them iconscapes, and they're really working. I'm a son of a psychoanalyst, or of a penchant for the unconscious, but I also think of them as sort of almost like spiritual, like portals into other dimensions. And I love, of course, the Lohman Foundation at the Met. They have that wonderful Dante Paradise circle painting too, and the idea of circles and everything that's about. And then I do think about, when I'm doing these larger installs, of the whole cosmology of my American Dream, first, second, and third acts, which of course would end in sort of a last judgment, that hopefully won't happen. But I always want to position, some of these more dynamic iconscapes to sort of herald the end of hopefully not our time, but at least the show, to remind us what's important about America, what we need to keep strong in order to survive.
And you see intimations of that in the works that you see here on the wall. And I just want to point out for a second, before we move back to the Karma show, this painting of Martin Luther King and his family at the piano. And there's a reprise of this family grouping that you'll see in a minute that's on the first wall at the gallery in Karma.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's right here in the center. So yes, so this is a painting. You can do the pronunciation of the title.
Zakalasa.
Okay. Yeah, so talk a little bit about this work, and also the source for this work is a photograph, right? And then your process of working from photographs, as people have already realized, some of the photographs that you work from, you take yourself, like of the Statue of Liberty or the Grand Canyon, but other ones are sort of found photographs, or if you know who made it, like this one, Gertrude Cesar, you'll acknowledge. But that transformation of photograph to painting, how does that sort of work in your mind?
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm the son, daughter, non-binary offspring of the pictures generation, and thinking about ideas of appropriation, but also going back to the original ideas of how photos were used as source material for Duran and Bernard and some of the people in the late 1800s when photography was invented. Casimir is a really interesting figure. She actually was a great photographer who was raised by a luminist herself. She studied painting. She probably was a lesbian because she was estranged from her husband who financed her. But she was inspired by the arts and crafts movement, and those flowers are actually there in a daguerreotype photograph. And I always think that when you take a picture of something, especially from historical figures, especially historical figures that have changed culture, maybe you're also capturing something of the spirit about what they're about, like things that are in the ether, kind of like spirit photography. And so, like a method actor, I come from theater and playwriting too, as well as comics. I really try to get inside the head of the people that I'm portraying, not like a ventriloquist, but especially with these historical figures trying to communicate, or not like the Hollywood medium channel them or anything, but try to get into who they were and really do my research, especially honoring people of color and different cultures. And so she was a great leader for Indigenous people. She was actually from the Sioux Nation, and at age 8, she was taken away by Quakers to a Quaker school in Pennsylvania, where they want to horribly get rid of the Indian, in quotes, to save the man. She actually excelled in that school. She was a great debater. She also studied music. She went to the conservatory in Boston to study violin. She performed for the president and all over Europe. She was also the lyricist and helped to compose the first Native American opera in America. But then she had this sort of turn where she went back to the school that she was raised in, the Quaker school, and she went back to her family home on a reservation, and her family was destitute and depressed, and she realized what had happened to her. And so she was really conflicted in her life about, being raised in this sort of Western European tradition and yet wanting to hold true to her own. And so she turned against the school and became kind of a whistleblower and started writing for Harper's, the Atlantic Monthly, that were very well read and widely circulated magazines, and also writing her own children's stories, which are incredible. It's all online. I listen to audiobooks as I'm painting, and so I was listening over and over to her stories about her hair getting cut at the school and how that was sort of a symbolic castration and so horrible for her, but also these amazing children's stories that are like lyrical and visionary, like Rimbaud, and sort of like in the soft revolutionary way, being very subversive, because people in America were reading them. Helen Keller wrote a thank you letter saying how great the stories were, but talking about what was happening at that time for Indigenous people. She and her husband then had an organization in Washington, D.C., had their own magazine and publication. She worked in politics to the end of her old life, and she was really heralded in her time. The photographs are amazing and sort of an entree into her world, but I hope people are rediscovering her now and learning who she was and realizing her importance.
So you just heard Keith talk very eloquently about this remarkable person who's the subject of this portrait. And I have to say, Keith, it is also remarkable that you write up these long texts about each of these works, which is part of apparently your process of making the works. If you look at like I mentioned before, if people look at the Cleveland catalog, you'll see that there's text about the works. And, they're not equivalent by any means, but it's clear that that's sort of part of your research that you need to go through to understand, especially a deceased sitter, and to try to do a portrait of someone that has a kind of focus and also a kind of meaning. And it comes out in these pictures, but I recommend, if you can, people should read some of these because it really
Thanks.
fleshes out what's going on here in these paintings. And
Well,
I'm interested in the idea that you're listening to audiobooks and at the same time, and the person's speaking, if there are recordings of the person actually speaking.
this one was amazing because, of course, I really want to honor, it's so important, these figures and really get inside their world. But she wrote eloquently about sunflowers, in particular, wilted sunflowers, and talking about her being 54 years old and having no name. She actually had different names, a Western name and her indigenous name, and how those were less important than being part of nature and so on. So it's, you get, of course, Gustin would say there's always a third hand painting the picture at some point, but you get into these moments where I'm painting her, listening to her words talk about sunflowers, and just feeling my own sort of electricity up my spine. And it's almost like they're speaking to you. It's incredible for me, and I've
You can
learned
channel
so much.
that.
And also all these people are teachers for me. They're really important. I paint to live, and I live to paint, and each one of these figures has really helped me in my life for my personal goings on, and also as I'm the chair of painting, drawing, and printmaking at USC, in my own humble way, a teacher, and in that way a leader, and they really helped me through my everyday existence. So I love these people.
I think they're wonderful, and they have a real post-impressionist vibe, not necessarily stylistically, but in terms of the conflation of decorative background with figures, which Van Gogh got so well. And of course, Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo about these people, Rouland and the other people that he was painting at the time. And that is something that was obviously critically important to the way that he was able to conceive his realist mission in art when he's working in the late 1880s. Right. You see it here, as opposed to someone like Gauguin, who didn't really care that much about the personalities of people. They were just templates for his own obsessive fantasies. Let's go
a huge Van Gogh fan.
The work in the middle of the room, the middle of the wall, is Dr. Martin Luther King and Family from 2021 as well. A new picture, also large scale picture, where you have the similar sort of activated background there behind Coretta Scott King, and then the four kids, one of whom is sitting on this sort of almost playfully sitting on this bear rug in the room, and the more serious looking paterfamilias there on the left. Riveting image, I think, and portrait.
Well, I hope this really anchors the show. I painted many pictures of Dr. King and a few of his family, and I like to think that we're all part of his family. I realize I am who I am. I am a gay, white, half Jewish man living with my, half indigenous husband, and I really want to take responsibility for painting people who are not of my ethnicity and culture. But I feel that with Dr. King, really, and the civil rights movement, I'm very interested in painting people who have changed the world, and certainly he and the movement changed the world, along with the whole family, who were all civil rights activists. The ones still living are still doing their wonderful work, and also, conduits, they're very spiritual into other spiritual realms. This is from 1964, this photo, and it was a snapshot. That little white dot above in the center there is actually a thumbtack. But there are other pictures that have been taken in this home, including the one I appropriated back in 2008 of them at the piano, which I called Drum Majors, which was, obviously invoking Dr. King's speech about how we all need to be drum majors in our fight for justice and human rights. And they love this rug. You see all these photos of them playing with this rug, and Martin Luther King Jr. III, who's sitting on the rug. In particular, love that rug. And I also teach about comics and anime and manga, and think about ideas of familiars and sort of spirit animals. And I unfortunately, sadly, lost my Anatolian shepherd dog, which are very large dogs, right when I was painting this. She had stage 4 lymphoma, and really thinking about her, but also her power. And thinking about this, I'm hoping that bear represents the power that still exists of the movement and everything that they fought for, that we can't forget, especially in this time when all is being threatened for what they and we all have been fighting for.
I think it does have that sort of quality of a state portrait in a way. And
Yeah.
I love the way that it's been expanded from the little snapshot, the small scale photo, into something that, you know, is exhibition size, that like a salon machine, sort of large scale painting of this, of America's, really its first family in the period.
That's right. I think it's one of the, you know, the greatest figures of the 20th century, bar none. And I think that this is hopefully monumental, in that hopefully this family and everything they represent is so monumental. So I'm hoping I pay tribute to it. And also, you know, hopefully it transcends into other spaces and other worlds. The wallpaper that they had in their home was fantastic. And, you know, they were really threatened at that time. You know, their home was bombed and all this stuff was happening. And I was listening to Coretta Scott's biography and listening to her speeches. But they held together as a family because it's all about love. And she would tell Dr. King, you know, make sure that it's not about your own ego, that it's really about serving the greater good of the movement. And in doing this painting, I really tried to think about this and keep down any kind of expressionistic flourish and hope to create testament to the family and everything that they stand for.
I couldn't resist a little bit of a comparison here with another work of American art, James McNeill Whistler's Symphony in White #1, The White Girl, where you have her standing also on an animal rug. By the way, sorry for the loss of your dog. What was the name of the Anatolian Shepherd?
Georgia, after Georgia O'Keeffe, and we just lost her brother, who was Jasper Johns, from another strange disease.
And you had a dog named Michelangelo,
who also passed away, at the same time. And so it was just a lot of summer of pet tragedy when I was painting this. But, you know, look, I love Whistler, and I would take the NYU kids to the Frick, and everybody would love, you know, the women in gray in that, especially women, because I think he was very good about portraying strong female protagonists. And obviously there's an irony here with the title versus, you know, the subject matter of my painting. But I know when this painting came out at the time, it caused controversy in the Victorian age, because I think it showed a strong female protagonist, and maybe that rug represented her power and virility. And the Victorian audience was really shocked by that. And so, but, you know, coming from a symbolist tradition, I'm really hoping that the bear represents power that is unceasing and still alive.
Exactly. And also his model was a woman named Jo Heffernan, who was an Irish woman with red hair. And in the period, that was part of the scandal. If you had red hair, it meant you were either Jewish, Irish, or a prostitute, or both. So you have an image of a woman who is castigated as someone marginalized in society, who Whistler is elevating to the scale of the Virgin Mary, without a crinoline dress. There's lots going on in this painting, but it's also an image of difference. I think that's an important element here, which he's sort of championing in this work. So the third work on this wall is this image of Cesar Chavez, also 2021. And I have just a couple of details, show you a sense of the surface. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how you have to work differently with the picture depending on the subject. Tone it down a little bit, maybe. Martin Luther King. I think when you see these works from a distance, they seem to have a similarity of surface, but they don't actually. That's why you should always see art in person. They, you know, leap out at you, and they have a real presence, both in terms of the imagery and the surface work. And here it's very sketchy and drawn, and it feels more cartoonish in a way than some of the other pictures.
Yeah, I think the sort of the triage of the three together, you know, King in the center, of course, and the family, but, you know, Zikalasa, which predated King, but Chavez, who was really looking at King and Gandhi and even Jesus for his own spiritual leadership. Andrew's family actually had a cousin, George Madrid, who worked for Chavez. who took time off of Stanford to, work for the movement. And I'm 55, so I grew up with him in the background and really remember, the Great Boycott and also the Coors boycott that that they were so a part of. And I was listening to his biography and also music that was part of the movement that they would play. And in the background, again, those grape leaves and flowers kind of go into hopeful sort of spiritual realms. But that shirt reminded me a little bit of like the net that grapes are kept in, and they hold everything, but they're sort of transcendent. And, of course, the button for the American farm workers says vote. And which is always like an important thing to remember, especially now. But he was so dynamic in creating rights for the not just the field workers, but like Dr. King, the working class, and really helped to elevate people and also immigrants and so on. I feel like Chavez is so pertinent for our politics at this very moment, and we really can't forget what he was about. And he was a great political but also spiritual leader for people, and we really need to pay homage and remember this great man and everything that he fought for. And some of my friends said he looked a little bit like Andrew, which I'm not going to deny, because I love Andrew, but I also love Cesar Chavez.
Well, he looks deeply human. I think that's also part of it, which is part of the appeal of this painting as part of this wall of American heroes. And then catty corner to it is this great map of the U.S., America from Google Earth, January 1st, 2021, 12 o'clock noon, oil and linen. And if you look closely, I encourage people to look closely. You can see things like a thumb and a hand, and then there's some wintry spirits, it looks like to me. Here, this eyes, nose, mouth here, eyes. There's an eye up here. It's sort of like a combination of Pollock's Eyes in the Heat and Chellichu's Hide and Seek at MoMA. All these paintings with, again, idea of symbolism is very strong in this work, and hidden images, or maybe not so hidden, but reading America as a living, breathing, topographical landscape, and very different from a kind of inert image from Google Earth.
Yeah, of course I love all your references. I also love Jasper Johns, and I had a dream one day of painting a North America without boundaries. And I woke up and I remember, of course, Johns, dreaming of, painting his flag image and then just painting it as the myth goes. And so I realized that Google Earth has great images of non-boundaries of North America from space. And I chose this one to, to mark obviously this year of transition. I also love Cezanne and like the Cubists who tried to formalize what Cezanne was about. For me, he was on a trust fund. He didn't care about selling paintings. He was working in plein air. And I think he was looking at Mount Saint Victoire and all of his landscape imagery and thinking about his past and his thoughts and using what he was looking at as sort of a map for his unconscious, maybe him not consciously doing this, but thinking his thoughts and his subconscious kind of comes out and is able to sort of map upon what is the reality of his worlds. There's paintings at the Met of rocks of Cezanne that go into these blissed out, otherworldly, Odeon Ray Dawn like dream worlds. Yeah. And so I'm always trying to, allow for that to happen. I want for that to happen. So I'm micromanaging. I'm really looking at the satellite image, which goes into great detail with my teeny tiny brush, but thinking my thoughts about America, and all this stuff comes out that I don't try to control. I don't want to illustrate it. I don't want to, make it specific, like little, people or anything, but I kind of leave it alone and let it be, and see what's out there, following that spirit and, the American transcendentalist landscape idea. So
pretty wonderful. I was wondering about Google Earth, the satellites. They take photos and it corrects it to make north, at the top. It must do, because it doesn't always shoot it from the same perspective. That idea of the, not only the arbitrariness of borders, but also the arbitrariness of the way that we perceive ourselves and the planet. You see it here.
That's right. That's right.
The wall on the right features 4 paintings that we'll just go through quite quickly because I want to get through all of it. 4 paintings here. The first 2, Lee Boggs and Gloria Steinem. this wonderful, assertive, almost, I don't know, it's a fabulous portrait. Whatever photograph you got it from, you've enhanced it maybe 10 times, almost accusatory in a way, but also very relaxed at the same time she's smoking a cigarette. And then these two images, which I'll show in a second. But you know, it's Steinem, of course, still alive. Grace Lee Boggs has passed away, but that idea of trying to understand a person from a distance. Have you ever met Gloria Steinem?
I wish. In fact, we
Yeah.
invited her to the show, but she was too busy to attend. I hope that she would have really liked this image. You know, they were great leaders. Grace Lee Boggs was actually part of the Black Power movement in Detroit with her husband, James Lee Boggs, who was a great writer and also a worker. But their writings are still taught in academia, and she was friends with Malcolm X and helped Malcolm X come to Detroit and so on. And then she was sort of rediscovered in the 90s by the Asian American community as just being a great, powerful leader for not just the community, but for all human rights. And both of them, I'm assuming that a lot of people, of course, know Gloria Steinem, who I also grew up with Ms. Magazine, and she was always in the background and part of the conversation. My mother was also a great activist and worked a lot for pro-choice campaigns, which is obviously really threatened right now. But interestingly, they did a lot of seminars and panels, and Gloria Steinem still does at colleges and universities. And they would go around and they became kind of life coaches, as well as guardians of the feminist spirit that they were part of in civil rights. You know, Gloria Steinem also always campaigned with African-American women and leaders as part of the movement that she was so much a part of with the ERA. And so I'm listening to their talks, I'm listening to their seminars, I'm listening to their campaigns, especially Gloria Steinem. Like she's such a tough cookie, and I really want to pay testament to her. There was a student in one of the seminars who raised a question because she said, you know, if Gloria Steinem said, if you see bigots or if you have a boss who's a jerk, just tell them to F off. And the student says, well, what if you can't tell them to F off because they're your boss? And then she says, well, the line that I always use is, are you kidding me? And so I'm kind of think with this photo, she's like exhaling cigarette smoke and saying, are you kidding me?
Rethink that. Outstanding. Excellent. I also want to point out to people that, you know, there's a lot of formal things going on in these paintings. They are deeply intricate pictures. They are in no way sort of just inert translations from photographs. I would never imply that anyway, but if I was going to talk about them in a review, but I would point out the predilection for the stripes forms, which are these sort of rivulets of color, which run through a lot of the pictures, pointillism on this vest, the chevrons of the arms, the sleeves of this shirt, even the crossword puzzle here and the computer keyboard. There's so much visual patterning and information in these works. And in addition to the fact that you have to deal with a visage, you know, a portrait of a person, their complications are really delightful. And also the color schemes, I find them really enticing. And, you know, we're in an age, thank goodness, when figurative art is okay. It's taken a while. But figurative art does not have to be redundant or repetitive or, you know, just based in the past, even though we will sort of relate it to other artists, but you're doing something vibrant and new here, which I really enjoy.
I think in our generation, it's how it's not like the photos, what's you about it. And, you know, I love Warhol, obviously, but I always felt he sort of flattened out his icons the way the agency was reified into Capitol, especially in the time of the 60s, the Beatles and Marilyn Monroe. And I think a Richter was always supposedly painting the surface, but not penetrating the photo. And why not go back to the source of how photography was used as a resource, you know, with Bacon and Muybridge, but also Bernard and all those people to bring out and glean what you can from the photo and grab every moment consciously and also unconsciously.
Yeah, the pencil of nature. You have to use it.
That's right.
So the other two works are one, Act Up, after Andrew Savalich's photograph from 1992, 2021, the spirited image of protest on the streets of New York City. And what, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, exactly. And then the other picture, just to go ahead, is this one of Harvey Milk. And again, we have this the consciousness of the broadness of the country. Harvey Milk here, who's associated most with San Francisco politics, a painting of him, both, you know, in a public venue, but also spirited. I think you get that so brilliantly here in this image.
Yeah. Harvey Milk was like an opera. You know, he loved opera, but he also loved Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. I realized the secret with Milk was that he was a sexy guy. Like, he was kind of a funny looking guy. He was like Frank Zappa or something. Like, he was like sexy, funny. And then he also had like this amazing history. He was actually the producer for Hair, or worked with the producers for Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar, all the soundtracks that we talked about growing up that actually helped to liberate me before I realized I was gay, just spiritually and ideologically. And ACT UP was really important as a movement for me. I was part of it, especially when I graduated from Brown and came to New York and went to a lot of the High Holy Days. And of course, they encompassed ideas of feminisms, the civil rights movements, and obviously the gay rights movement that Harvey Milk helped to champion and spark and be a hero for. Sort of putting them in the middle, but thinking about how these movements are still very much alive in our day and how we have to remember and honor them, but also honor these people who are able to make change happen, and optimistically for hope for, you know, new generations to impart change and make sure that our country goes on the right track.
Yeah, and I think this whole wall, which is about these people who are devoted to protest and change, something, you know, as a aspirational element of American society, which, you know, we saw happen even in the midst of COVID with the BLM movement and the marches throughout the country, and real change at the ballot, at least last year. See what happens this year.
They were also all
2 years ago.
Philosopher activists. They were also really thinking and reading and writing and talking and thinking about the bigger picture of, you know, even Hegel, and thinking dialectically, and that also helped to fuel the fire for their pertinent concrete actions that they were doing.
So moving from there to this, which is of course the genius work of the show, I think, anyway, the one that I kept coming back to just because it's so ebullient and fascinating and big. The Rainbow Connection 2021, large scale oil painting with every possible Muppet and more you could imagine, and a picture which celebrates the close of the original Muppet movie, which we're the same generation. You know, it was such a out there work and such a postmodern work, really, that film. And then this final scene where all the Muppets are revealed singing the Rainbow Connection, and you're still going to cry if you see it. A kind of idea which comes out of Henson and Frank Oz of hope for a communal American, a communal society, no matter how tall you are, no matter what color you are, no matter what your skin or fur or feathers are like, and that you can all be joined in song. You know, it's like,
that's right. Exactly.
It's the craziest and the best thing ever.
Another sublime moment for even us as kids, you know, in the theater, seeing all the Muppets all at the same time. This literally a Dos Ex Machina moment where they're talking about their story and, you know, making it bigger, whatever. And the hole falls in the ceiling, a rainbow comes out, they're all singing, and the camera pans back. But I think a lot about popular culture, obviously, and being a teacher of comics and narrative art, I really, I think it's so important that, you know, fine art's still too rarefied of a world, but when you're like Henson and co, you're really making stories and allegories for the whole world. And the Children's Television Workshop, which helped to devise Sesame Street, was really working along the lines of the civil rights and human rights movement. Ideologically, they were very consciously and practically embedding Sesame Street with all those ideas. And so for me, growing up in the cul-de-sac suburbia of Denver, it was my conduit to civil rights and human rights. And, you know, speaking through the avatars of icons, as you say, who are different colors or different creatures, everybody could be Kermit, everybody could be Miss Piggy, but all of it was about difference, but coming together. And I kind of think analogous, you know, the frame is North America from space to this. It almost feels like all the people in North America, or at least Manhattan, singing together and being together as one, even though each one is very individual. Also, this was an outtake from the actual movie, and so you see the puppeteers who are, as you look closely into it, who are actually puppeting these creatures. And I think about, you know, how painting, like comics, is also helping to, make images kind of come alive, make these puppets come alive as characters in our world. And you have the James Ensor in there too. And of course, I think about the cacophony of Ensor, those individuals of, Kreisinger. Of course, I love that painting and the whole cosmology of it, and all the interrelatability of all those characters who all have their own little super egos, like the Muppets. But they have to put those things aside to follow the North Star of what they believe in.
My teacher in grad school, Robert Rosenblum, called it the greatest painting west of the Mississippi. This picture of James Ensor. And I show you this image that I took of it in the old gallery just to give a sense of its scale. But it's also, a cartoonish kind of work, and one in which you see the combination of all culture. And of course, it also has a socialist bent, this painting, which we don't have time to get into. But there's some wonderful commonalities between these two works. And then just these couple of details here of your picture.
Yeah, strategically, he was using masks and so on to talk about the icons, but here you could see the real life people who are like operating the puppets and making them come alive. And then the top right. Chef. Yeah. Well, of course, I'm watching Sesame Street. I know I grew up with Sesame Street. I could do all the Muppets
Harry
impressions.
And I always loved the eagle. He just seems so world weary, and as if he had a secret knowledge that no one else did.
Sam the
there. Yeah, also, that canonical idea of the Muppet with the wide open mouth, just the idea that their mouths are open because they're always talking or yelling or singing.
Yeah, and I also want my subconscious to come through like the top right, when I'm glad that you excerpted that, because to me, it goes into this other kind of iconic abstraction from my mind's eye. And I always think, loving comics and cartoons, the power of the icon. If we dream, maybe we could visualize dreams, maybe they would look very simple, like iconic characters, like the smiley face or a Muppet, and we project meaning onto them. So I really want this to sort of bliss out into other worlds too, where my own unconscious icons are coming through.
Can I read a quote from you about these works? So
yes,
this is
please.
from one of Keith's writings about these paintings. This is Keith. To me, cartooning is really close to puppetry. I thought this is a wonderful analogy, because obviously with the Muppets are just pieces of Muppet felt that have Jim Henson's hand up Kermit's butt, who makes Kermit animated and alive. And that's what you do with cartooning, the alchemizing of ink into characters and being. And now what I try to do when I paint, at least for iconic cartoon-like figures, for real life personas, I try to channel their energy and talk to them like a barber cutting their client's hair, to spend time with them, learning and hopefully honoring them while I paint them, hopefully complimentary and respectful portraits, but also in this process, try to animate the scene as if they were alive and talking with the viewer. And I think that's just a beautiful statement about, what you do, how you channel yourself and your passion into your art.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Cartooning is close to puppetry. Everyone's
it's
think
true
a bit about that. It is true. It's totally true. And also the idea that, that and it's so true, and that Henson and Oz are artists. They were artists.
Mm-hmm.
What they were making was art. And to see distinctions between what they do and what you see in avant-garde theater is ridiculous, because there's a consistency there that's so important. So let's look. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I was just going to say is they were also great actors, and they're infusing their own spirit into an iconic form. I was just watching the Matrix movies. It's kind of like that, where the Matrix is sort of a trans allegory now, because it's about becoming something else. And I also feel, obviously, with painting, it's very much like that. I love Rembrandt. I love Warhol, but I also love Rembrandt. If you could, use the pop iconography of the relatability of a Warhol, but infuse it with sort of the spirit of the emotions and the ineffable that Rembrandt had, maybe you could have something.
Yeah. So the back room of the show, and here's the Muppet painting that we just looked at. And going into the back room of the show, and you see it's 4 walls, but with less works. 2 pictures on the entry wall. And then the return wall is this gorgeous sunset. And then on this side, you'll see that there's an image of the Empire State Building, and then a few works on the left wall. But you start with this ideal pairing, obviously, of Walt Whitman and Kermit the Frog, 2 great New Yorkers, as you see them here. And Kermit, this is how you describe Kermit in your writing. Kermit the Frog is this kind of hapless, sensitive guy who may or may not be straight, who goes out with a pig who's a drag queen or a trans person. He's finicky, he's kind of bossy, he's arty. That's Kermit the Frog. And Walt Whitman on the left, who maybe you could describe as in the same way. But here is the green boy from the Kermitage collection 2021, Kermit the Frog, oil on linen. I would say it that way because he always emphasized the definite article when he introduced himself. Not a frog, but the frog. I remember a friend of mine, Tim Barringer, who teaches at Yale. He was on a train once and there was a minor crash in England. And then in the news report about it, they interviewed him and they called him an art historian, Tim Barringer, instead of the art historian. It's like, you need the definite article. So Kermit understands that, Kermit the Frog. But I love this wonderful painting that you see here. And of course, it's related to the recently restored painting by Thomas Gainsborough, the Blue Boy from around 1770, which lives in the Henry Huntington Library and Museum in San Marino, California, not far from you, and has just been cleaned and is on its way as we speak to London to be exhibited in the National Gallery. The first time it's been lent and to return there 100 years after it left England. Amazing. But canonical painting.
Yeah, amazing. So these pictures from the Kermitage collection, and thank you for that great description. I love it. Hi, Kermit the Frog here. I grew up with a calendar in the book of the pictures from the Kermitage collection. This was a very canny, funny lampoon that was actually constructed by the Muppet people, but also the National Lampoon people. And they reconstructed these paintings with props and everything, and they were so good. And so I feel this is an appropriation of an appropriation. And the secret here is to try to make it, in quotes, a real masterpiece, to try to bring back and herald how important the Muppets were for everything that we just described as great characters and creatures of popular culture that help to change culture, just like any fine art, but also Gainsborough and everything that this painting represents, which is definitely a queer spirit and has been embraced as such by the LGBTQ community. And, it's not easy being green. Kermit is othered. And but he's still a leader, and he does feel sorry for himself, but not in a Morrissey kind of way. He's always optimistic and trying to keep his North Star engaged, which I always think about being a chair of a department with all of its politics and so on. We always have to keep the Muppet Show going forward. And so I definitely obviously identify with him, but also Gainsborough. He was a quick painter and a very facile one that was also very visionary. What I do is I transpose the Muppet onto not the prop set of the original calendar, but the actual painting. So I'm literally looking at the Gainsborough background with a Muppet photoshopped in front of it and getting into the visionary idea of the Gainsborough, which goes into all these other worlds and is truly amazing. But trying to really, make a serious painting about an ironic subject and painting past the kitsch, but also talking about him as this queer spirit and the legacy of fine art meeting popular culture.
Yeah. And Kermit, for all his public profile as a reporter and everything else he played on the Real, he didn't really like dressing up in costume. That was Miss Piggy's deal. That was his thing. So I always feel a little uncomfortable. And I think you sense that here with the tight lace collar and his sort of squashed expression. And the link with the Gainsborough is obviously a great one, not just visually, but also because the painting on the right is a deception, because it is a picture of a working class boy, supposedly, although some people have started to counteract this reading. But Jonathan Buttall, who was the son of an ironmonger in working class Soho in London, who Gainsborough, dressed up in these Van Dyke costume, and yet gave him a sense of swagger, which he couldn't avoid. And if you go to the Frick right now, Frick Madison, on the top floor, you'll see the Gainsborough wall here. And this is the kind of Frick portraits that the kind of Gainsborough portraits from the 18th century in Britain that Frick would have collected. That is upper class people in upper class occupations like St. James's Park in the center, wearing the top fashion of the day, etc. But Gainsborough had his own private world. He painted landscapes and he painted working class people in a way, especially he painted some rustics and peasant children and cottage scenes, the kind of thing which was not really very saleable, but gets to the root of the, sort of the open-heartedness of him as a person and as an artist.
And he was really into the visionary landscape, and he always wanted to paint landscapes. He got sick of portraiture, but then the way he tricked people was in his later life to have these beautiful portraits, but with the visionary landscape behind it. So he had his cake and ate it too.
Yeah, it's great. Terrific channeling of that. And then the Walt Whitman is this wonderful painting based on or channeling this image at the top right, which is a photograph from 1876, the Lear photograph of Whitman, Lear as in Shakespeare, not Lear as in the male gaze. But you see him there with a beard which has a life of its own, this beard.
Yeah, thank you. Whitman, of course, to me is a hero, and has been a hero so much for not just LGBTQ culture, but poetry and American narrative, and is so important. And for me, Leaves of Grass, which was his everlasting, monograph of poetry that he would keep inserting poems and taking and editing out, and doing edition after edition of his American Dream of Leaves of Grass, is very much analogous to what I'm trying to do with My American Dream. And by the way, we're going to have a monograph, hopefully, of My American Dream coming out soon from Karma. But this was, in the frontest piece of Leaves of Grass, he has usually this engraving of him as sort of a young dandy, as a bricoleur, kind of going through life. But then as he aged, he started to resent that image of him, and he really wanted for his last edition of Leaves of Grass to have this image be the frontispiece. And so I want to honor that. And of course, I'm thinking of Lear, Shakespeare, but more, of course, of Whitman. I'm listening to the poetry while I'm painting, and of course, he wrote My Body Electric, and about the idea of like transcending our corporal existence of our flesh suits and going into a larger spiritual realm. And so I'm, listening to this poetry, and his beard starts to turn into otherworldly things that I'm obviously not trying to illustrate, or his head or the spirit around his hair, and trying to depict not just his corporeal existence, what he looked like as an older, wise, and totally out gay man, but also the spirit of the poetry that he is still alive, not in his flesh suit, but in his words that still have such great meaning and import for us.
And his sense of community and interconnectedness, which every term I take my students on the Staten Island Ferry, as you did, and have them draw the Statue of Liberty, but we read Crossing Brooklyn Ferry by Whitman.
Oh my gosh.
That necessary film, which connects everyone. And that idea, which, is not foreign to Kermit either. That's the whole point. It comes across so nicely.
I shivers up my spine. Thank you.
Empire is on the back wall, 2021, the Empire State Building, which you've been photographing for years and years. Every time Keith comes to New York, you'll know, because there'll be a photograph of the Empire State Building from like a Uber going at high speed on the West Side Highway. Of course, it's getting harder and harder to photograph as more and more bad buildings spring up around it and cut down on that singular view that you always had in that part of Midtown. But that sort of dramatic site, which of course relates to so many works which have the title Empire, from Carl Andre or Manifest Destiny, and Charles Ledre's last show at Peter had a small bricks, which he titled Empire as well, and Andy Warhol's from 1964, the most stately depiction of it of all.
When I lived in New York for 25 years, when social media was coming about with Facebook and then Instagram, as sort of a non-denominational prayer, I would take a picture of Empire every day and kind of post it obsessively, really thinking, of course, about Warhol and this incredible movie that nobody's ever seen the entirety of because it's so long. But also, I lived in Soho for a while, and I would see Manifest Destiny, that stack of bricks that's in the Donald Judd Foundation that says Empire on it, and thinking about how our empire hopefully will last, but maybe it's teetering kind of like those bricks. But obviously the actual building itself, which was built in a couple of years in the Great Depression by Mohican indigenous peoples primarily, that was so optimistic. And, out of the ashes of the Depression comes this incredible building that took a while to get filled with renters. It was the King Kong movie that actually helped to popularize it. But interestingly, after COVID, there was a New York Times article about how there's a lot of vacancies again. But for me, it's still really optimistic. I love the look of it. Obviously, it's really super phallic and all the negative things that could be brought about by that. But just the idea of the sort of optimistic spirit that is New York for me. And this was a picture I took from Instagram. It was really pixelated, but I like to paint the pixels as if they're real going into this other space. And this was during the time that my poor dog Jasper died. And I was painting this really when he died. And so thinking about, gateways to heaven in a non-denominational way, that maybe this is a stairway into another spirit or another realm, but also thinking about the New York spirit and America's spirit and how we have to keep fighting on and not forget the optimism and hope that has made this country great.
Yeah. And that drew people to this place.
Yeah.
And may have even, led to their eventual death, like Lennon here, John and Yoko outside the Dakota, 2021. Have you seen the Beatles documentary, the Peter Jackson?
Oh yeah.
Film,
oh my
Get
gosh,
Back?
I loved it so much. I loved
How
it
good
so
is
much.
that? Everyone should see it. If you haven't seen the Beatles documentary yet and have a spare 8.5 hours, you should do it. And I thought it was extraordinary, just the kind of window into not only watching people make art, which you don't get to see that often, but also, they're being at the peak of their game.
Yeah, it's, Let It Be is a kind of a sleeper hit for the Beatles. Like, obviously every Beatles album is amazing, but the Let It Be is actually a great album. And it's amazing seeing the making of this, especially with Yoko, because Yoko gets such a bad rap, especially early on in the more misogynist, racist time. But she is very much in the film, and she's not like a fifth wheel or anything, but she's not like all the controversy. So she was interrupting everything. Even Paul says in the new documentary is like, would it be tragic if everybody think that the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp?
50 years from now, if people think that that's why they broke up.
Jewelry, but to see this amazing, great artist who's also a multi-millionaire because of her business prowess, like yodel and shriek and do all this incredible stuff, it's still very avant-garde. I really think that she taught John how to be an artist. I mean, obviously he was an artist before, but from the Beatles, which were all about postmodernity and speaking through avatars like Eleanor Rigby or Hey Jude wasn't about, John's divorce specifically, it was Jude. But then with the Plastic Ono band and their own albums like Manet, they're talking about their own life and their own ideas and their own very specific concrete politics. And because the music's so good, because the import of what they're saying is so important, it became, in quotes, universal. I love it, just in Christmas, you hear their Christmas song, which is so subversive, and also the Imagine song, which is so subversive in its way. They're great artists, and I still love listening to their music, and even the Marriage album and all, the Wedding album and all the really avant-garde stuff. My parents were like taking off on it because it's so natural, and I love this image by wanting to bring something new to it by putting it in color. I put the flag on it. I also trying to gaze through the sunglasses of John and really think about them. It's funny to me, the hand, because there's sort of a wide angle lens, but the hand becomes sort of big. And
I know, it's creepy.
To me, it feels like Yoko still carrying on John's spirit, in her pocket.
It's true. It's amazing in the documentary how demure she actually is in that, and you think of her status as an artist, as a major artist working.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just wonder if Ringo and Paul look and watch that documentary and think, how ridiculous that we broke up because the magic that was happening. And, I think artists should be thinking about that all the time. Am I in a moment right now where I'm doing my best work? And it's partly due to some kind of communal activity that I'm engaged with. and to throw that away would be a mistake. But of course, John found Yoko and came here and did all kinds of new stuff together, you know, in every way, much more important than any of the rest of them.
Yeah, and the sense of play and everything, so important.
Yeah, it's key. And one of the other works on the wall is this you can't get more in New York than Jones Street in 1964, freewheeling Bob Dylan after Don Hunstein's great photo from the album cover. And the two of them unified, both freezing. I thought about that today when I went outside, take my son to the bus, but also, you know, a sense of interconnectedness, and the effect that she had on Dylan was huge.
That's right. You know, and I grew up with this album, and of course I would look upon it, think about, oh my gosh, I want to move to New York. And like, this is the bohemian spirit of what art is all about, you know, being able to speak about politics through poetry and music and everything. And she really did help to change him, because he, of course, came from the Woody Guthrie tradition, but she was very immersed in her own politics and taught Dylan how to, you know, speak very specifically about things that were happening in their political culture at that particular moment, and was really important for his sort of upbringing. And you know, Dylan to me is an amazing icon of artistry, because he's still at it, and it's still really, really good. He's had, you know, ebbs and flows of you know, creative prowess, and yet the music is still excellent, and he keeps the faith. And he doesn't let people tell him what to do, and he never sold out, and he's just a genius artist. But also, you know, thinking about ideas of New York, and you know, this room is sort of the popular cultural figures that are so important for our world. You know, the front room sort of civil rights, but these popular cultural figures help to shape ideologies. You know, my ideology, and still you know, the ideologies of even young people, my students today, you know, think about Dylan all the time, and think about how important he is.
I teach him too in the same class that I do the Whitman. I mean, he's the inheritor of so much of that. And of course, the younger students, they don't really know it. They don't know it at all. Maybe their grandparents listen to it.
Yeah, and Suze Bertolo was
Suze. Was Suze or Susie? I'm not sure how.
Susie.
Yeah, probably Susie Bertolo. Yeah. All right, so the last work in the main gallery, and then we'll move on very quickly and show the works on paper and the other works in the other section. But this beautiful work, a combination of Turner and Emil Nolde, expressionistic light and color and sun, with this marvelously glassy sea that you see below, sunset at Venice Beach during COVID 2021. That looks really nice today.
This was
maybe respond to this a little bit.
Yeah, this, you know, I'm thinking, you know, Grand Canyon was the West, North America is North America, but then this was opposite the Empire State Building. So I'm trying to get, you know, not just this land is yours. And we were in Venice Beach, and it was a bristling day, and everybody was terrified of COVID, but I, like these other people, took off my mask and ran into the ocean before I could breathe any COVID air, and just like plunged in. It was so much about freedom, you know, against, you know, being shackled by COVID, and you know, we were all living in our homes then, and so there was a very bittersweet, almost post-apocalyptic vibe, and I came out and I had salt in my eyes, and the sun was so bright. I took this picture. I couldn't even see what I was taking because I was crying, both for the emotions and the spirit of it, but also the salty air. But I really want to kind of capture that feeling of freedom, and you know, the everlasting idea, the sublime of the sun and the sea and the boat in the background, hopefully taking us to different, better worlds.
Yeah, I think it works. Enough said. Yeah, it's a beautiful coda to this part of the show. Let's go out the doors and take a right, and just quickly to the other Karma venue, which you see here, nicely lit up, which Emily opened for me that day. And I just wanted to point out that it is right next to a building here on the left, which has one of the all too infrequent historical markers on New York City's streets. We are not as good at London at this, although we have enough history to do it. But Allen Ginsberg lived here from 1958 to 1961. And he wrote Kaddish here in apartment number 16 for his mother, Naomi. So wow. Another, he's not in one of the paintings, but he's there in spirit, adjacent to Karma. I
was really thinking of the Karma and the East Village and the artists there. And yeah. There's a painting that I did of that too. But I guess I should have done Ginsberg, but I guess I was channeling him with Whitman, because of course Whitman was his hero too.
Yeah, and Dylan, of course, also.
Yeah, and Dylan, yeah, absolutely.
So very quickly, the smaller space here includes a number of works on the walls, both on paper and on velour, which we're going to need to look at, and this one painting of a similar scale to the works in the other room of Joe and Kamala. The left wall has this series of 5 works installed with bookended by a fire and a hurricane, and in the middle, a hurricane of American opposition to fascist policies of the previous administration and beyond. But this work, maybe talk a little bit about painting on velour, pastel on velour board, in this image of Paradise, California, forest fire.
Yeah, so this room is sort of these panoramas. I think of them almost like comic strips of these suites of images that in a nonlinear way relate to one another. And it shows there were historical and cultural figures in the main gallery. In this gallery, it's all the people that were a result of all those historical figures, also including people like John Lewis, who is obviously a bridge between that time and this time. And I was thinking of this one as sort of a storms panorama that starts out with the wildfires in Paradise. And, of course, it's Paradise Lost. It's being rebuilt now. And, the idea of our house is on fire, which is the Greta Thunberg, fantastic speech about alerting the world to wake up because our house literally is on fire with global warming. And if we don't do something to stop it, it's going to be tragic. It is tragic right now. And so, having these images sort of buttress the civil rights people, I think they're sort of all of the same ilk in the idea that we're under political fire now. And, I love Black Lives Matter. Patrice Cullors was one of our great MFA students at USC. I can't, say I taught her anything. I did some studio visits and she was a genius. She is a genius in her own right, but how that as a movement is really carrying forth the civil rights spirit of the 50s and the 60s into our current times. And obviously this was them at TC. John Lewis, this is from a photo that was taken by somebody, thinking of it as art. And so I'm hoping I'm not appropriating an appropriation. I really want to pay homage to the actual photographers and the people in them. But one of my students teaching comics at SVA was Nate Powell, who did the series March with John Lewis. I got to actually meet John Lewis, the great man, when he came to visit for the convocation speech at SVA. And he grew up reading the Montgomery Story, which was a comic book about Dr. King and the civil rights movement that were happening in the bus boycotts, that as a teenager helped him, along with a lot of other people, join Dr. King in the movement. And of course, this is him going to Black Lives Matter Plaza at the end of his life, and then thinking about that legacy and everything that stood for, thinking about that bridge, but also sort of a bridge into the sort of all these people to me must be, if there is a heaven and if seraph and angels actually exist, or the closest to God, like he would definitely be there because he's changed culture so much and has done so much for our world. That image was so impactful.
It's a really powerful image of an unbowed, figure, someone who has, been diminished by time and age, but is, pushing on with the cane, with the mask. And I appreciate the way you brought the face and the hands into colored focus. And the rest of him seems consistently still in motion, in a sense.
Well, I'm thinking obviously about comics and cartoons, but also I'm very much about his spirit. I think he was very strong at the end of his life, actually, and so impactful with all the documentaries, all the attention that was paid towards him. And so even though he's no longer with us, obviously John Lewis is very much part of our world.
Yeah, and here's Harkin Florence. This fuzzy texture of the velour board, which allows you, I guess it allows you to get really deep into it in a sense, and when you're applying the colors.
I actually lived in the East Village on Orchard Street when I first came to New York back in the 80s. I worked at Marlborough Gallery uptown at the front desk and so on, but I lived above the Salwin leather store. And they said, like, the leather, I bought my mom a person, they would say the leather's like butter. And the velour is this beautiful velvet surface that just absorbs the pastels. It's just like butter, rendering on them. But I'm thinking, of course, of the Deluge drawings by Da Vinci, and also Turner, who was really obviously interested in weather. And the idea of these storms that are plummeting our country because of global warming that almost have a life of their own. The eye of the storm actually looks like a real eye. And thinking about the deluge of our time, and of course painting from satellite photos where you get more detail than anything.
And across the way you have these images which are of American politics in the moment, with St. Fauci in the middle, and these two images, one oil painting on the left, which already showed Biden beats Trump, and then this side image away. Here's Biden on the left turning away, shaking hands, and behind this wonderful human moment of love between Mayor Pete and his husband, behind Biden's back after the presidential debate.
Yeah, I've been painting pictures of who won the presidency from the cover of the New York Times front page after they won. I skipped Trump, thankfully. But I started with W, actually. And so this was the image that I painted Obama both times of, what was on the New York Times front page the day after they won and how important it is. I mean, in some ways, this whole show is all about Kamala Harris. For her to be our first woman vice president, who's also a person of color, is so important. And it couldn't have happened without all the history that's depicted. I know we get disillusioned and it's still a super tough time and democracy is a peril. But these are the folks that we have in office that need to, champion us through and beat Trump the next time so we don't become a fascist autocracy. And to remember the spirit of when they were elected, how great that felt. And like when they actually came into power, how amazing that was. And also amazing that Pete Buttigieg could run for president and be a viable candidate that gained proudness that still is super important for our politics. And who knows where he's going to end up. But to have them kiss in public, to think about, Andrew and I couldn't be married. Biden is shaking hands, but he's part of it. He's part of the whole family of it.
Yeah. And then this reminded me of, I didn't put up the image, but that important Warhol painting of the tuna fish can disaster with the images of the people who died from whatever was wrong with the tuna fish and that the problems of the supermarket in the 60s. I should have put that up, but anyway, this is, I think, the most moving work in the show. 8 Catholic sisters die of COVID within a week, and so symbolic of the failure of our recognition of what was going on, and the failed response of the government in the initial months of the epidemic.
Yeah, America's Most Wanted, right? But also inverted. Or I also think of Richter, all the famous Jewish people and so on. But like try to give these people agency. And Andrew went to Catholic school, my husband, and he actually suggested doing this picture, which I loved, because these people were so innocent. They were nuns and they were teachers. Nuns who are all living in the same nursing home, who all died within the same week. And then there were more that followed. But I listened to their eulogies. They were online and they were incredible people. The woman on the bottom right was an incredible, beautiful Emily Dickinson-like poet And her poetry moved me to tears. I quoted an essay for Anne Craven's wonderful catalog of her marvelous work, because it was so spiritual, and like how to capture all of what's happened with COVID. There's so many different ways, and nobody could ever capture it. But I'm hoping that this sort of gleams what's happened, where all these horrible things happen to such beautiful, innocent, wonderful people.
Yeah, horrible loss, and the numbers just keep ticking. And I think this is a work which, I mean, I can understand the sort of sustenance that you get from making your art, and also the necessary sort of expiation of, you know, agony in a way, and working through it, and then channeling it in this sense, and making it in this pastel portrait, which is, you know, it's a testament to these people who were total innocents, even, you know, so late in life. They were innocents who were caught, swept up in all of this.
Well, I hope it's a good homage for them. I really, I love them, every one of them, as I was rendering them.
Yeah. So final image, I think this tripartite image of the momentary success of 2020. Let's see if it continues. I hope so. And Fauci wonderfully in his Washington Nationals baseball bandana or mask that you see here, which is no longer good.
Up the same people who were part of the science edge of ACT UP, the insiders who were against Fauci, actually marched against the CDC and Fauci. We had burned effigies of Fauci at that march because he was
in the 80s.
But then he embraced ACT UP and really brought them in, and ACT UP was able to help the CDC come to new ideas about, obviously there's not a cure for AIDS, but create all the meds. And of course, he's an amazing hero, and that's his favorite team. But also, he was squelched in the Trump era by Washington. Stacey Abrams, I was listening to her books, and she's obviously an incredible writer and amazing political leader. And her books are really great treatises about how to gain power and how to incorporate. Was important for me as a teacher, but also for the South. I think Georgia couldn't have been won without her, and I'm really hoping that she's going to finally get the governorship. And victory, this was after one of the debates where they joined hands. That was from a real photo of the flag in the background. And to me, it still heartens me, despite our disillusionment about what's going on, about that these people are still in power, and with God willing, and with all of us, and with trust and with hope. And like Harvey Milk says, you got to keep hope alive. Hopefully we could beat the risings of fascism within our own country and win.
Absolutely. Well, let's close there for now. Let's move into questions. I just leave you with these two images because Keith and I have a mutual interest, as you've already heard, in comics and cartooning, but that will have to wait for another conversation. In the meantime,
these are all they're real life superheroes.
Real life superheroes that you can see at Karma right now. They do exist. I've called you in my Instagram account an American painter optimist, and I think that works. It's a refreshing approach, and there's so much more to talk about in terms of style and material and picture making. But let's leave it there for now.
You gotta keep hope alive.
Got to keep hope alive. Thank you all for attending. Please don't go away because we have questions and then poetry. But I really appreciate it, and I love the show, and I hope people can get to see it before it closes.
Thanks, Jason. Yes, keep hope alive. And Caroline Crumpacker talked about hope is coming up. So hopefully, I realize that we're going on, but hopefully this is interesting.
No, it's good. It's good. Turn it back over to Ty.
Thank you, Jason and Keith, for such a wealth of conversation today. It's really been lovely to hear you guys go in depth about the work. To open up our Q&A, we are going to go to the head of our ship, Fong Bui. Fong, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you, Keith. Thank you.
Fong, thank you. Thank you for the Brooklyn Rail and all that you guys do. It's been such an important journal for us and all of art in America and the world for so long. And I'm so proud to be part of this. Thank you so much, and for everything. And I love your portraits too.
They haven't kicked me out of the country yet. Sent back to the labor camp in Vietnam.
Yeah, maybe we could be in the gulag together if things go bad. But we'll have interesting stuff to talk about.
I will. But no, it's really terrific, inspiring. I'm sorry I have to take a few calls and I need to go to another meeting. That's why I go first. Usually I always go last. But it's terrific. Listen to both of you talk about your incredible undertaking. I think Anne Craven and I once revealed our secret guilty pleasure and profound love for Bob Ross.
Absolutely.
And so there is that incredible, if other people would think of it, low brows, you know, but that low brows or whatever, you know, I would say is a form of spiritual fellowship.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Cosmic optimism, you know.
Yes.
You think back about Walt Whitman. I once actually talked to Allen Ginsberg about this, you know.
Wow.
We were friends. And
wow.
And you know, we talk about how did it become such a strong, brilliant political sermon where when you read it again, it's so incoherent, you know. Doesn't even organizational logic, clarity whatsoever, but because of its exuberant energy, you know, the uncensored that expression of it, and that's what counts. You know what I mean? It's like,
that's right.
Yeah, I mean that was what 1871 when it was written, and I know it has significant profound for everyone who read it, including one of my favorite writer who I'm rereading now, published in The Nation 1915. It's called Democracy versus Melting Pot, colon, Kallen, colon. It's very important. So because of that immersive spiritual fellowship and the fact that you don't censor yourself in every subject there is to get your eye fixated and excited, for sure.
Yes.
Very day one beginning. He even filmed Yoko Ono coming to work from Japan. She was 16, you know, as as 5 years later, bringing John Lennon to introduce him to him because she was his secretary, you know.
Wow.
Many other people like that, or whether going to Avila to pay spiritual pilgrimage to Santa Teresa in Spain.
Yes.
Spending time with Allen Ginsberg, you know, in San Francisco, or being kicked out of the film festival in Vermont, or filming a cockroach trying to get a cockroach on Broadway where he lived. I mean, it's no hierarchy.
No.
So what's my question? I forgot. No, my question is that were you aware of Jonah's work at all?
Yes, of course, you know, and I think there's such a great leader also who lived and breathed the spirit of art through everything that they did. And maybe predecessor, maybe to like the museums, you know, the Boston Museum School, they call it, of Van Golden Checkers and so on, like creating art out of the life. But also I think maybe Manet or something, I don't know. And I think about cinema a lot, you know, obviously I think of nonlinear narrative. And I think of these almost like dream sequences in movies, if you're able to storyboard it, because like the juxtapositions are very pertinent to me. I know instinctively how they go and consciously how they go. It might not be apparent to everybody, but then when you look at the nonlinear sequence of like Amika's film and the things that there is a spirit that kind of comes alive. I always think that art's close to poetry and also comics too. I teach composition via the gag cartoon because I always think gag cartoons like in the New Yorker about two or more things put together that don't normally go together, but somehow create a fission that in which case is humor. But poetry is about putting words together in ways that don't normally go together. And you create that fissure of the ineffable, of that feeling of the thing that transcend language. And with cinema, especially the cinema amicus and those who followed, was about putting those pieces of life, those glimpses of our life, whether they're high or they're low, together to create their own, wonderful narrative that's about the palatability of our own life, but also our dream life in our world. And yeah, high and low are non-binary. It's, thinking dialectically, there's no binary between high and low. It's just the venue in which you see them. But if you can look at it for a long time and think about it for a long time, for me, it's art. And comics are for the people, but they could also be very high culture, and they infiltrate our cinema now. It's so important. But I love the idea of fine art too, because you don't have an art director telling you what to do, and you supposedly have the freedom of making the images that you want. But it's too rarefied of a world. So I love teaching comics because it keeps you from getting hit by lightning, because those kids go on to the world and do their thing. And I think about narrative all the time in terms of editing and juxtapositions, in a concrete way, critiquing that work and starting my own visual narrative art program. But I also am very true to fine art and the spirit of fine art, and that realm of when you're doing that play and putting those things together are the things that you can't control and the things that you can't put into words, which I think is true for the poetry that you're speaking of, and also Lucas's work.
Super duper. That's so good. Thank you, Keith. Jason, in the spirit of Bob Rosenblum, who really brought back Norman Rockwell in the early 90s at the Guggenheim, that was super shocking for a while. And then now it's so accepted,
Yeah.
So it takes time. Anyway, it's terrific, you guys. Thank you. Good to see Anne Craven here.
Yeah, thank you, Anne.
I don't know, where are you? Are you in Maine? Yeah, I'm sure she's in Maine.
And she's writing for the catalog for Karma. I'm very blessed that Anne wrote a wonderful piece for the Karma monograph, and I was able to write something for hers.
Cool.
I was so honored to write for Keith. Keith's amazing show. I'm
going there tomorrow morning with a friend. So sorry I came so late. I just been.
Thank you.
I've been.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Anne was my first Art World.
Yeah.
Anne was my first Art World dinner. And when Andrew and I first came to New York, we went to one of her spaghetti dinners way back in '94 or something. And she's been a true blue. And artists and poets together, right, Caroline? Following the ancient and also Tibor Denage kind of spirit of that. Poets should write about art. Artists should, create covers for their chapbooks. And we all take on the world together. Alliances.
In the spirit of Giordano Bruno, I be missing the reading, Caroline, but I will listen later. Congratulations, Keith. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you,
another great one as always. And I see you soon. Bye, you guys.
Thank you, Fawn.
Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you, Fawn.
Everybody else stick around.
Yeah, just Fawn.
Go ahead, Ty. Bye, Fawn.
We are going to continue this lovely conversational style of Q&A and pass the mic next to Caroline. You should be able to unmute it, Will.
Hi. Well, I want to thank you. That was amazing. I really enjoyed so much that really thorough look at Keith's work, and just I felt so edified and buoyed by the conversation. So thank you, Jason and Keith. It was really fascinating and optimistic and just really capacious in every way. So thank you. And I guess the question I had a little bit is, I've been to other of Keith's shows over the years, and I'm always, struck, like each canvas is so rich and you can lose yourself, but then at the same time, there's, like you were talking about, the ways that the juxtapositions work. And I'm a little curious, like I'm thinking of one of the shows I went to that had, the Marx Brothers and Anne Frank and Louise Bourgeois and James Dean, and they were all kind of hanging out in the same room. And I wonder how, when you're making those portraits, are you thinking in terms of the arc, or are you thinking you just get into each one and then the next one arises, or are you sort of putting them in conversation from the get-go?
You know, I both at the same time. I kind of think of barbershops, you know, and the barbershop, the first chair is the one who's next to go. So the idea that's nudging you the most, this thing, you know, the portrait or the person or the idea that is like imprinting on your mind is always the one to do, because they want to talk to you and you want to talk to them and explore that idea. But that was from a show called Good Leaders, Endangered Species, Ships at Sea, Part 2. And it was right when Obama was elected. In fact, he was like the poster of the show right before he was elected, and he became elected during the show. And people were like, well, this is nuts. How can you put Louise Bourgeois, Anne Frank, and the Marx Brothers together? But to me, like, you know, they're all great artists. The Marx Brothers, it was a scene from Duck Soup where they were singing about going to war. And there was all this cacophony and craziness, but they were making an allegorical idea of, you know, man's humanity, man, the horrors of war, but doing it in satire, which is so impressive to me in a populist kind of scale of making popular culture. You know, Anne Frank, what can you say? I mean, like, she dynamically really wanted to be a great poet, a great writer. She loved her mother, but she didn't want to be as domestic as her mom. And she really wanted to tell people about what was happening with her people during that time. And it was performative because, of course, she was writing a diary and she was doing exactly what she had wished for and what she had hoped for, you know. And to me, like, she is a fantastic writer of art of any era, and also a coming of age type story of like Judy Blume, like, because she's also coming into her own womanhood. And then Louise, you know, Louise Bourgeois used to bring the NYU kids to her salon. They were like exquisitely boring 5-hour-long things, hopefully not like this talk, on Sundays, and it would usually be around Easter. You know, you would call her up, and I knew her from Robert Miller days, and she would make me sing a little song, and then she would allow me to bring my kids in to see her, and she allowed me to take a picture of her to paint a portrait. And to me, she's the quintessential artist because she lived and breathed her work. She didn't get famous until the 70s when she was in her 70s. And she consciously, critically was thinking about politics, but, you know, feminists would say, oh, it's about feminism. And she would be like, no, it's not, go away. Psychoanalysts would be like, oh, this is about psychoanalysis. And she was like, no, not, go away. But everybody was right. You could throw a lot of noodles at her cabinet, they would all stick because she was thinking very consciously about what she was doing, but also unconsciously the next, and how the closure happens in the viewer's eye or the reader's eye about how, you know, you might have somebody chasing somebody in axe in one panel, and the next panel the words IE coming out of the building. But then what happens, the murderous act in this dark kind of case study is happens in your imagination. And that's the closure. If you become a participatory in the creation of the content of juxtapositions, then it can move you as a viewer or as a reader of poetry, and you think your own thoughts, your own third meaning ways of entering into the subject matter. And so for me, that was important for all of these shows. And it's something that not necessarily people get, but, you know, sometimes they go through a show and they'll be like, you know, it was weird. I was on this, it felt like I was on this strange journey or ride or something, or I come from theater too, and Richard Foreman, who you wonderfully worked with. And who I used to bring the students to after having them read Wojciech and the Comte de l'Autrement, and thinking about ideas of juxtapositions. And I really hope that in these shows, they are a little bit like living theater of different scenes that don't necessarily make linear sense, but as a viewer engages with each image and puts it together in their own mind's eye, it creates something that is transcendent from that subject matter to the own viewer's gaze, but also their ideas about how they could take those ideas into their own life and make the world a better place.
Thank you. That's amazing.
I tried, Caroline, thanks.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Keith, for, I feel like that was like a little mini interview. That was lovely, thank you. We are now going to go to a final question from G.E. Schwartz.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Keith. and I wasn't that familiar with your work. So I really enjoyed spending this time with it. And as I was looking at it, I was reminded of this quote by Howard Thurman that whatever may be the tensions and the stresses of a particular day, there's always close at hand the trailing beauty of a forgotten or unremembered piece. And so my question is, sideways from that, is your goal for us to luxuriate in that which is close at hand as you present the ideal of optimism, hopeful progress, and radical change through an appreciation of what you see?
I hope so. I mean, for me, honestly, I live and breathe these things. Each one to me is sort of a miracle based on like the craziness of my life, both as a chair, as a teacher, as a politically, obviously engaged person, and in my art. Like, I really think of art as a meditation, and I needed these things to survive this last year. I really did. And I'm hoping for viewers that they find the same kind of edification looking at these images and putting them together in their own mind's eye, but with each one be able to, reflect upon it as a painting, hopefully a beautiful painting that gives them respite. But also in terms of their anecdotal ideas as a antidote to our time, and specifically for this, when Bush came, when I started this whole My American Dream series, W had just come into power. Instead of doing Bush's bad paintings, I wanted to create images of people that were the lives and the spirit and the ideals that do make America great, from our own political and cultural sphere, and to remind people what's important. I had to do, scary Trump paintings just to get them out of my system. These people and the cultural antecedents of them really made the world a better place, and that we could do this. You got it, like Harvey Milk says, you got to keep hope alive. If we all know that we have agency, as an artist, I always think art is language and language is power. But then how does that power affect people? How do they take it into their own lives? How can you keep that seed of hope alive? I'm a hippie at heart. I do think art can change the world. I know that's old school, but I totally believe that's true. And, even on this rarefied fine art level, the museums are so important, the galleries are so important. I remember after 9/11, there's a line around the block to see the Da Vinci show, which of course was a blockbuster anyway. But even in Chelsea, people were like, haggard and sort of like knocking on doors, hoping galleries are open because they needed art. I need art in my everyday existence, but I hope that we all need art. We all need, I'm hoping that this new Atelier school and how the far right has, weaponized, real classical realism is not going to become the propaganda art of a new fascist world, but instead art that's about critical thinking and aesthetics and beauty and transcendence is the thing that keeps us going, that keeps our heart and our spirits alive. So we could forge a place for the future. It's so crucial right now. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in 2022 with the midterm elections? It's terrifying. But if we got to keep the hope alive so we could to beat this thing and to keep beating this thing so we could have democracy and liberty and happiness for people, and I do think like the Martin Luther King, the arc, is real, and the moral arc is important. But for me, I'm hoping that all these paintings and what I do gives other people edification, respite, and for New York, that the show could be a little bit of my own personal blessing for the people of New York and America, and hoping that people can see this show and feel like, what, times are bad, but we're going to get through this. Just like each painting helped me get through every month that I was painting it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for that so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
What a lovely note to end on. Thank you, GE, for that hopeful question, and Keith for your incredible answer. We are now so lucky to go to poetry. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending all of our events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Caroline Crumpacker, to the stage. Executive Director of Opus 40, Caroline Crumpacker, lives in upstate New York with her daughter Coco and partner Roberto Roski. She previously ran the Malay Colony for the Arts, an artist residency program and art center. Caroline was a founding poetry editor of Fence magazine and editor of the French-American online magazine Double Change, and a contributing editor for Circumference magazine. She is currently a member of the Belladonna Collaborative and is the author of the chapbooks Recherche Theories, The Institution in Her Twilight, Upon Nostalgia, and Astrobalism. Caroline, take us away.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And, you know, I have to say, Jason wrote something like, how great would it be to have a class with Keith. And I was so happy to see that, because obviously it would be really great, but it's really great just to be Keith's friend and have these conversations in my life over the years. And they have really, Keith's art and the things he says about art and the generosity he brings to his art have absolutely changed my life. And it's really so great to be part of this conversation. And it's interesting, I was looking through some poems from the last couple of years last night just to think what would be the best poem to read. And it was interesting how many of them felt like a little too snarky or a little too harsh, given Keith's tremendous generosity and, you know, the optimism of his critiques and the critiques of his optimism. And I felt like, how do I match that? So I ended up with something very New Yorky and a little Brooklyn that I think has, you know, some of Keith's influence and a little nod to Frank O'Hara, who hopefully we all love a little bit. And it's called Intra. Alone in the Building is a song for our times. Location, location, iso-location. Once upon a time in Brooklyn was its very own city. That was a good time for Brooklyn. Now there is the Barclays Center, and St. Anne's Warehouse goes on for miles. Once upon a time, doctors made house calls, barouche to door. On hold for an hour with Aetna, only to be referred to Blue Cross Blue Shield, maybe I long for the barouche. Where would we be without Aetna? Mighty arm of a mighty state. Perhaps the barouche to a moonlit building by the seashore as a child, sharks in the warming waters. Brooklyn Queens Expressway, thy name is a curse upon the city. Thine officers, the brutal arm of a brutal state. The Brooklyn Bridge is still a miracle, but the apparatus of trust around it has eroded. Its classic chords, its heart is breaking. Upon the shores of its only rival, that bank town, moneyed heart of a moneyed body politic, Manhattan, you slay us, get up. Yes, urban agriculture has had its missteps. No spray heirloom apples fallen freely from the tree, the tart I despair for the rooftop medicinal gardens and front stoop cabaret, languages, memories, and a different time-space alignment at every subway stop. Finally, we, New York, rise to our obvious pataphysics. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. It was amazing.
It is my pleasure.
Thank you so much for that lovely reading, Caroline. It was really so beautiful. And thank you again, Keith and Jason and the whole team at Karma for your varied ways of making today what it was. And thank you all who tuned in today and for questions and ponderings in the chat. As always, we will share the recording of today's program in our YouTube archives, so it'll be available in a day or two if you'd like to revisit this conversation. And we at the Rail do this every day, so please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 67th Radical Poetry Reading, curated by Luigi Ballerini, featuring poetry read by Susan Briante, John Lotta, Mary Jo Bang, and Maria Grazia Colandrone. And now you can all turn on your microphones to say goodbye and hello as you leave.
Thank you, everyone, for all your patience. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline.
Caroline.
Hi, Anne.
Thanks to my parents for coming, and Scotty J for being there today, of course. And Anne, thank you for coming. Slate made an appearance.
All right, here we are.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you,
Thank you
Caroline.
so much, Keith.
Charlie, happy New Year. Happy New Year, everybody, by
Happy
the
New
way.
Year. Thanks for the awesome
Happy
New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, everybody.
Happy New Year to everybody.
Great poem,
Happy
Keith.
New Year. Stay
Thank you,
safe.
Mom and Dad.
Go see Keith's show. It's gonna
Yeah,
blow your
congrats
mind.
on the show,
You
Keith.
gotta
Thank
see
you.
Keith's show.
Be
It
safe and
closes
wear
on
your
8.
mask.
Thank you, Alexis, and everybody at Karma. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you, Brooklyn Rail. Please see the show. This is the last week, but it will live
Yep.
on, and hopefully
Well
in
done.
infamy.
Yeah, and we've documented it. Here it is, documented. It'll be
Yeah,
on
it's
YouTube
awesome. Thank
in
you,
perpetuity. Thanks,
Yes.
everybody.
All right.
All right, have a great one. See you.
Thank
next
you
time.
all.
Thank you.
Jason.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Hi, Nick.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Be safe.
Wonderful to